I would now like to introduce our first speaker, John Shipman of Con Ed. Con Ed serves 3.3 million customers in the greater New York City area. John is Con Ed's Department Manager, Electric Vehicles. John, welcome to the EVCx Forum.
Thank you, Dave. And thanks to Shauna for being coordinating all these efforts leading up to today's event. So just as a piece of background, Con Ed operates in New York City within the 5 boroughs, Manhattan, Brooklyn, the Bronx, Staten Island, Queens, and we have Northern Territory above New York City in Westchester County. That makes up about roughly 700 square miles of service territory with a population of 9 million people. We have about 3.3 million customers in the electric system, and we are a T&D utility without generation assets. Other than generation for steam output, we also are a natural gas and a steam distribution company. So today I planned on walking through some of our efforts in electrification of transportation and our thinking behind where we want to go and how we are best suited to get there. Our guiding principles essentially are to increase electric vehicle transportation adoption, identify targets with high potential use cases, test concepts and business models as things develop over time for different segments of the population, form strategic partnerships where appropriate with various stakeholders in the industry, and raise awareness to the general population regarding electric vehicle options. And what we've structured is pilots and efforts in support of those electric vehicle adoption goals. In the support of public charging, we have incentives in place for public quick charging. We have public quick charging hub development efforts going on. We've worked with our transit agency, the Metropolitan Transit Authority, on bus electrification. And we have a pilot going on curbside charging with the DOT of New York City. We also encourage homeowners in residential space to do most of their charging in the off-peak period to have the minimum impact on the distribution grid. And we have residential time of use rates dedicated to EVs or a whole home time of use rate with a 1-year price guarantee. And we have a unique program called Smart Charge New York, which is an off-bill, off-tariff behavioral incentive program where we monitor where, when, and how much electricity is consumed. And for customers that charge in the off-peak periods, we provide them off-bill rebates. We also have efforts in place to enhance awareness and education. We've had a presence at the New York Auto Show for the past 11 years, which did get canceled this year due to COVID, but tentatively will be rescheduled for July, or we'll be back there again next year. And we have a marketplace that does some comparison for consumers on electric vehicles versus similarly equipped internal combustion engine vehicles. One of our offerings is an incentive for public fast charging interconnection. We operate a mostly underground networked distribution system with an N-2 design criteria, which means that 2 components can fail and the customer still has complete service and reliability. But what that does is it happens to drive up some costs associated with the interconnection for new EV charging loads. And so we created a program where the utility, who normally under their tariff would pay for one service to a property and would increase the capacity of that service if it went to the same point of entry on the property. The problem with that approach was that where you charge an electric vehicle is usually the furthest point away from where the service comes in to the switchgear on the property. And so we were willing to pick up the cost of that second service for publicly accessible DC fast charge stations. And that allows the customer to get a service for EV charging where needed. We also have a business incentive rate that gives up to a 39% discount for delivery and demand charges associated with public EV fast charging. And layered on top of that is a statewide additional per plug incentive that was designed to address the challenge of low utilization and demand charges. So what we did was we did an analysis across the state by different utility sectors and determined what was the spread in costs between a volumetric commercial rate and a demand-based large commercial electric rate. And the per plug incentive is designed to fill that gap so that over the time period of the present through 2025, the customer will pay for his electric service on a basis that's equivalent to what he would have been on a volumetric rate. They maintain being on a demand rate, but they do get a rebate that comes back to them to help cover those costs. There's a current proceeding in New York State on a make-ready program that will expand some of these things, and I'll get to that in my next slide. But we also have in place the ability to do interconnections today for fleets underneath the same premise. And you can see that can affect almost 2/3 of the capital cost of building out a charging station. Under the new light duty state proceeding, the utilities allowed the concept of investment behind the property line. And this would be treated in a slightly different manner. The interconnection piece would be traditional new business as a capital cost, and the behind the property line is currently contemplated as a 15-year regulatory asset. However, with those increased investments and rebates behind the property line, we can be covering up to 90% of the total cost for the capital infrastructure build out. Ownership of the charger at this point in time is not contemplated by the state for utilities. In our service territory, we're very dense, we're very vertical. 700 square miles with 9 million people, you can imagine. And so bringing power to every place where someone wants to charge an individual vehicle in a multi-unit dwelling can be very expensive. So our approach has been to identify utility-owned property where we could potentially make the land available for third parties to build out infrastructure and run and operate those, almost as a gas station model where people could go to the hub, get a quick charge, and then park their vehicle wherever they happen to park it. We have a RFP that was out on the street that closed last Friday for third parties to invest into that space in a property we own in Brooklyn, Nevin Street. And we're in the process of evaluating those RFPs now under what the state calls REV demonstration projects, where we look for a third-party contribution that is valuable. We look for testing new business models that allow for a reduction in the cost for the third-party developer and utilization of an asset that is held for future use, but can be used in the interim before a substation is needed. At that Nevin Street site, we have contemplated commingling battery storage with EV fast charging with up to about 20 stalls. We've done a bunch of work with our local transit authority. They started a pilot in early 2018 that brought 10 transit buses into the city operation. 5 of those buses were stationed in Brooklyn, New York, and 5 of the buses were put into service in Manhattan. The 5 buses in Brooklyn are Proterra, and the 5 buses in Manhattan are New Flyer. Proterra buses have 440 kilowatt-hour battery packs, and the New Flyers have 150 kilowatt-hour battery packs. Clearly, the higher the energy storage in the battery packs, the higher the upfront cost for the bus. So this was an attempt to determine what the best strategy was moving forward. This is a picture of a overhead pantograph charger for one of the Proteras in Brooklyn that we installed with the MTA. It outputs at 500 kilowatts, this particular one. We have 2 overhead pantograph chargers in Manhattan, one on the east and one on the west side of 42nd Street crosstown route. And those output at 300 kilowatts apiece. The 2 depots, one in Queens and Maspeth, was outfitted with 50 kW chargers initially for the buses, and the depot on the west side of Manhattan was also outfitted with 60 kilowatt plug type chargers for the New Flyer buses. Since that time, the MTA has placed an order for 15 additional 60-foot articulated buses that are all electric, and they'll be housed in Manhattan out of the West Side facility. The in-depot charging infrastructure has been installed for those buses, and I believe 8 of those have been delivered so far, with the balance to come in throughout the rest of the year. We're also working with the New York City DOT on a curbside pilot to install 120 charging ports. This design has a service panel on the main unit, and then the auxiliary units are daisy chained off of that downstream. We can do up to 3 posts at a location, and each post has 2 charger cords on it. Our intent here is to act as the first mover in the public right-of-way space that is under the jurisdiction of New York City DOT, and see if we can develop a business model that could potentially create a franchise opportunity for the city of New York moving forward for charging. We have a lot of garage orphans in New York City, and up to 52% of the people park on the street at some time. And so getting charging infrastructure for people that don't have a driveway or a garage or a fixed parking spot can be challenging. And it's our view that curbside charging is going to be a critical element in really getting expansion up to the policy level that New York State has set out. Their ZEV MOU commitment was for 850,000 vehicles by the end of 2025. And so we need this kind of infrastructure in order to really get the penetrations we're looking for moving forward. In New York City, anything that goes in the public right of way is required to get reviewed by the New York Public Design Commission. And you need to have a product that has the look and feel of the rest of the street furniture that's in that space today. So we worked with Add Energy to redesign their existing product so that it fit in with the street furniture that's currently out on the street. And we got approval from the Public Design Commission. We've put out communications to community boards and elected officials identifying that our intent to site these. New York City DOT is selecting the locations where we can put them, and we are doing all of the make-ready work for them. Add Energy is owning and operating the units, and they, under the business model, will get reimbursed under the revenues that come in through the chargers. We filed the plan with the commission, got approval on it, and we expect deployment to happen in the latter part of 2020. We also have incentives in place for level 1 and level 2 charging. I mentioned a little earlier about a Smart Charge New York program. It's available for light, medium, and heavy duty vehicles. We do have over 2,000 vehicles enrolled in this program today. If you compare that to time of use rates, we only had about 200 people on the time of use rates. So an off tariff off-bill rewards payment seems to be favored by most customers, but we can provide up to a 10%, 10 cents per kilowatt hour incentive for off-peak charging, midnight to 8 a.m. Plus, we give bonus incentives for avoiding our summertime peak period of 2 to 6 p.m. We are a summer peaking utility, mostly due to air conditioning load. And we've collected lots of data on charging sessions and driver behavior, and plots of when folks charge are highly correlated to the incentives that they can receive, with 93% of that charging done in those off-peak periods. The time of use tariffs that we have are two for residential spaces, one being a standalone rate, which at this point in time requires an additional meter in order to get that data. So there are costs associated with that for the customer. They need another meter pan, they need an electrician to put in that additional service. And so we find that many folks see more value in the smart charge approach. We also have a whole house time of use rate where a customer can have the whole home on a time of use rate if they own an EV, and we provide a 1-year price guarantee. So if the standard flat rate is exceeded when they're on the time of use rate while they have their EV, then we'll reimburse them the difference, and they have the option to go back onto that flat rate. Most customers end up staying on the time of use rate, but it can require some modification of loads in your home beyond the EV charging load itself. We've also got a pilot going up in Westchester County in the White Plains School District for 5 vehicle-to-grid electric school buses. We used the Lion product up there, and our thought was that we wanted to enable technology that was scalable. Most V2G that has been done and is done today is done with a DC fast charger, because you can bypass the inverter that's on the vehicle and do that off board. But our thinking was that if you have a field of school buses and you want to electrify your fleet, it's going to be very difficult to pay the price that a DC fast charger carries for all those buses. So we wanted a solution that worked on an L2 charger that you could buy for about a $5,000 price tag as opposed to a $50,000 price tag. The thinking here is that school buses are parked in the summertime, and that's when we peak. And if we can utilize the battery asset that's on the vehicle and push that power out to the grid during peak times while charging in the off-peak period, that we can add value to the proposition of ownership for the fleet operator, who typically just has his assets idle in the summertime, not making him any money. There are about 8,000 school buses operating in Westchester and New York City. And so there is a potential to scale this much further. There have been some technical difficulties on the V2G inverters, and things like having the bus plugged in and not charging was sending false signals to some of the control systems. We found some technical issues embedded in software. We found some technical issues embedded in hardware. And so we've worked through those bugs. We can get a reasonable charge in and discharge out. And this summer we'll be activating the full output of the 5 buses back out to the grid. On marketplaces, we have a site up that does a comparison of ownership costs and TCO between an electric vehicle and a similarly outfitted internal combustion engine vehicle. And we have a marketplace for purchasing of chargers as well. We've recently upgraded our marketplace such that you can use Home Advisor to get a quote for installation of your charger. And we've provided some incentives to customers that purchase vehicles after doing comparison shopping on the site to see if we can incentivize people to move throughout the process and not only study and explore and learn, but also make the commitment and jump in and get an EV and ease their installation process for the charging that goes along with that. And I'd be happy to take any questions that folks may have relative to any of the subjects I brought up here.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much, John. So many of us would have difficulty even comprehending the challenges that you have in the New York City area with all of the significant dense infrastructure. We do have some questions. We've got a number of questions, and for those of you who are listening in, feel free to go to your webinar screen. We've got a few minutes to address these questions. John, first question in, what are regulators looking for in transportation electrification programs?
Okay, I think the regulator's role is to look out for the ratepayer, right, and ensure that investments are reasonable and have a reasonable payback. And so, a benefit cost analysis is kind of paramount in most of those investments. We need to demonstrate that there's a positive BCA such that money that we collect from our ratepayers to pay for programs will in the long run benefit them. And so there are several tests that are used. There's the ratepayer impact test, there's the participant cost test, there's a societal cost test, and a properly structured program can pass all of those tests and show that the benefit to the ratepayer, to the consumer, and to the general population are all in the positive direction, and thus easing their decision process.
Great, thank you, John. Another question, can you speak to the overall cost versus value of the Smart Charge New York program? Are the incentives and program and hardware costs larger than the value of the load shifting?
Okay, so the cost of the program is covered by the offset in the T&D investment that would be required, plus the societal benefit from the emissions reduction. So the program is BCA positive, and the equipment cost is fairly low. It's a device we plug into the onboard diagnostic port. Of course, a lot of these things are driven by what is your T&D upgrade cost, right? So it won't necessarily work for every utility, but in our service territory with the primarily underground network, M-2 design criteria, those costs are relatively high, and so it does pencil out.
Thank you very much. John, next question. I would expect that off-peak EV charging at home would be a good incentive for whole house TOU rates. Have you tried to promote whole house TOU rates to EV owners?
Yes, that whole house rate that we have gives that 1-year price guarantee for EV owners. So they can basically try that whole house rate at no risk in the short term. And like I said, most folks who try it stay on it.
Thank you. Next one is, what's an effective approach to engagement with commission staff?
So I would say that speaking with them early on when you have thoughts about projects or pilots or programs, and really sitting down and talking through the pros and cons of approaches, investment opportunities, ways to earn on those investments is really important, because very often you can restructure things to the point that it's more beneficial from their perspective as well as from our perspective. And I think both parties move off of their initial positions through those discussions, and that allows for a better outcome.
Thank you. Next question. John, what are Con Ed's plans to tackle electrifying Class 8 trucks, especially in terms of the freight traffic between New York and New Jersey ports and logistics failures, deliveries, etc.?
So Class 8 is a tricky one. Most of those trucks today do not have much range, but certainly enough to go from the ports out, or from New Jersey into New York. The approach that the industry has taken is for high megawatt output charging. Our thought is that we need to have communication across state lines and within the corridors of the traffic movement, so that we're not just building for what may be here at the moment, but we're building for the entire ecosystem that takes place. And so that's where it's really important to have relationships with other utilities that are contemplating the same thing, and design the size of your efforts to align with theirs as well.
Great, thank you. Next question. What are the challenges that you face with fleet electrification?
So a fleet's critical mission is delivering the goods or delivering the passengers if it's transit. They're not really focused on electrification. In many cases, their senior leadership is setting out aspirational goals for electrification. But as you're dealing with the fleet operator, they know a lot about their fleet, but they are focused on that critical mission. It's really important to try to take a lot of the decision making and the educational requirements out of their hands and try to do that for them, so that they can get up to speed quickly on what needs to be done. They can evaluate options. And most fleet operators are in a position where, prove it to me and I'll believe it. Anybody can come in here and try to sell me on stuff. They know their fleet very well. They know how many miles they do a day. They know what their fuel costs are. And so if you can build capabilities that educate them on the payback, the TCO, the reduction in maintenance, and the possibility for a return on their investment, they're much more open to talking with you and taking the steps necessary to put together a package that they can go out to bid on, so that they're comfortable that they're getting the best price they can for the goal that they have at hand.
Thank you. Next question is, John, can you please explain the demand charge relief program again? Maybe a little bit more detail there.
Sure. So a demand charge is usually set within two continuous 15-minute periods. In most utilities, it's pretty close to that. So what that means is if I've got a 500 kilowatt overhead pantograph charger and one bus comes to it and charges, that demand charge is set on the bill, so long as they were there for a half hour. If no more buses use that, the cost of the energy that went into that one bus from a bill perspective is the supply kilowatt hours and that demand and delivery charges, which is going to be enormous. You need to have many vehicles utilize that infrastructure and to spread those costs over, so that you can be cost competitive with the fossil fuel that you're trying to eliminate. The same thing holds true in public DC fast charge space. If you don't have utilization, you don't have a lot of customers, you're going to set that demand charge in the first half hour, maybe at 50 kW, maybe at 150 kW. In the case of some of the charges we're seeing going in now, 350 kW. So what this program tried to do is recognize the fact that when the volume of vehicles on the road are low, the utilization probability is not very good, right? And so they're faced with a financial burden. We do believe that demand charges are appropriate and that they set the right signal for commercial customers to manage their demand. But we recognize that EVs are kind of a unique new technology, and we wanted to put something in place to help address that. Many people argue for elimination of demand charges. Some people argue for only volumetric rates. And so what we did was we looked at our commercial volumetric rates, which in our territory cap at 10 kW, but it's only billed as kWh. And then we looked at our larger commercial rates that are demand-based rates, and most of the collection is through demand. The idea behind the demand being that helps recover the infrastructure cost needed for meeting that peak load. And what we said was, what's the gap between those two billing models, given a certain amount of increased penetration of EVs on the road and therefore utilization in stations through 2025? And we modeled that with all the utilities across the state, as well as the Department of Public Service and New York Power Authority. And we arrived at a per plug incentive that fills that gap between the volumetric rate and the demand rate, so that that situation is relieved.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the detail there. Again, just a reminder, if you've got a question you'd like, please tap it into the screen at your discretion. John, next questions come in. What might you consider to be some of the top challenges for utilities when it comes to EV implementation?
I think the first challenge is, if you're just starting out at this, is getting the internal buy-in that this can really happen. I think more recently, that's not as much a challenge anymore, but if you go back 10 years, that was quite a bit of a challenge. People didn't necessarily believe it was going to happen, and they wanted to see evidence that you should be investing in that space. Once you're past the internal challenge and you get buy-in for your company efforts, then it's really to look at the segmentation of your market and your customers and say, where are the places where we can add the greatest value, and where can we fit those efforts into existing capabilities that we have? So is there a way for the new business process just to be modified slightly in order to address the needs of EV charging loads? Is there a group in your energy services area that should be dedicated for looking at new EV charging loads? In our case, we were geographically set up so that each borough had its own group that looked at these things. But if you think about it from a charging station developer, if I'm a Tesla or Electrify America, and I'm the same person responsible for building a charging station in Manhattan, Brooklyn, the Bronx, or Queens, I'm coming in with the same potential station design, and the utility is giving each project to somebody different in those geographic footprints. And therefore, I have to educate them about what I'm doing, and they have to come up to speed. So we recognize that as a shortcoming. And what we did was we built a central group that all EV project loads that come in through our project center filing for new electric load are routed to, so that those folks have the capability and the knowledge base, and you build a relationship with the developers and their staff such that you ease that burden.
Thank you very much. If those are some of the challenges, what do you see as some of the top opportunities for EV implementation?
Well, there are a host of ways to look at things. With the current talk about a lot of medium and heavy duty electrification, I think transit buses are on their way. I think if you look at the greenhouse gas and particulate emissions from the medium and heavy space, compared to the vehicle miles traveled, they travel fewer miles, but have a larger share of the emissions. In our state, probably 93% of the vehicle miles traveled are light duty vehicles. And if you're going to invest in infrastructure and the costs are similar, you might get more environmental benefit out of the medium and heavy space. The light duty space per vehicle is a small contributor, but there's a mass market there, and therefore the numbers get big fast. And so it's trying to find that balance between what's the best bang for the buck in terms of investment and return on your benefit cost analysis, and what needs to be done to align with the state policy goals so that you have support in the areas that can drive you towards those objectives the fastest.
Thank you very much. Next one is, what are some of the top things utilities must get right as they implement their EV strategy?
I think it's the stakeholder engagement. We work really hard at trying to meet our customers' needs and understanding what they want. You're not always going to see eye to eye. You're not always going to have the same perception of capabilities, and just having good relationships and constant stakeholder outreach really helps. We do quarterly stakeholder engagements in the space where we bring folks together. We have presentations from various stakeholders on finance, on school bus electrification, on medium and heavy, on transit, and we share the meeting spaces pre-COVID across the stakeholders with NGOs and other people in the EV ecosystem. And I think that dialogue makes people realize that we all want to get to the same place. We have different drivers that we have to be concerned with. And ultimately, if we work together and collaboratively, we can come up with solutions that work for each segmentation of that market.
Thank you. And what things should we as utilities avoid when we're considering implementing our EV strategy?
I think trying to just optimize your position at the cost of others' positions is a problem. I think that it's easy to build programs that have a good strategy for investment, but maybe not work well in the market. And so, the ability to be flexible and to pivot when required is really important. And so we always strive for the maximum flexibility, the ability to get a program approved, but along with that, the future capability to modify, adjust, learn, and move in a new direction rapidly without having to file another program or file for a change to the program is really important, because things change quickly, the market adapts quickly, and the typical utility commission, Department of Public Service, staff relationship is a good one, but it can be bureaucratic at times because you need to get commission orders in order to move ahead. And so I think really, if there's one word I would say, is flexibility. Build in flexibility build in the capability to recognize you don't have all the answers, and you're going to learn new things as you move forward, and have the capability to modify quickly and offer a better program to your customers.
That's a very wise counsel for sure. The whole flexibility, the stakeholder relations and flexibility are very important things to take into account. Those are the questions that I have at this point in time, John. So with that, I would like to thank you for just sharing with us what's going on in the large city and areas around New York. Again, many of us can't really comprehend all of the significant challenges that you're dealing with there, but thank you so much for sharing your insights and experience at this time. So with that, everyone, as we mentioned, we're going to be, thank you very much, John. We'll let you leave the camera. So with that, we're going to, as we mentioned, we're going to bake breaks into our time together to try and prevent as much screen fatigue as possible. So we're going to break now, and we'll be reconvening at 2:15 Eastern. So we've got just a few minutes to do that. And we'll be coming back with Franz Leprand from Hydro Quebec. I know Franz has got a very exciting story to tell as well. So we'll let you go for a break, and we'll see you back at 2:15 Eastern sharp. Bye for now.